In medieval England, power was rarely measured by titles alone. It existed in whispers, in signatures pressed into wax, in who could and could not approach the king. And in the year 1316, a man who should have been little more than a footnote in history managed to climb into the very heart of royal authority. His name was Hugh Despenser, the Younger. Hugh was not born into greatness. His family was noble, yes, but not among the towering dynasties that dominated English politics. He was the son of Hugh Despenser the Elder, a loyal supporter of Edward I. That loyalty earned the elder Despenser land and a seat among the magnates, but the family was still regarded as ambitious outsiders. For the younger Hugh, this meant he had much to prove, and no hesitation in trampling rivals to achieve it. When Edward II inherited the throne, he was already a king ill-suited to rule. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as affectionate, impulsive, and far more interested in hobbies like rowing, construction, and rustic farm work than in the brutal machinery of medieval government. He had already shocked the nobility with his devotion to his first favourite, Piers Gaveston, whose arrogance and extravagance earned him execution at the hands of outraged barons in the year 1312. Edward never forgot this loss, and in the years that followed, he turned to new companions. Among them was Hugh Despenser the Younger. In 1316, Hugh secured the position of royal chamberlain. To most, it seemed an unremarkable appointment. The chamberlain was officially little more than the overseer of the king's household, a kind of glorified secretary. But Hugh understood something the nobles overlooked. Whoever controlled the king's chamber controlled the flow of information, petitions, and favours. In an age when written charters were the lifeblood of politics, and access to the monarch determined wealth or ruin, this was no small task. From the moment he assumed the office, Hugh turned routine administration into a throne of his own. He reorganized the household so that every request for royal attention passed through his hands first. If an earl wrote to the king, Hugh decided whether the letter would ever be read. If a bishop sought an audience, Hugh alone could grant or deny it. The king's chamber became a bottleneck, and Hugh the only man who held the key. Imagine the frustration of the great lords of England. Men who commanded armies, who held estates larger than counties, now found themselves waiting outside the chamber door, subject to the whims of a minor knight with a sharp tongue and a sharper memory for insults. The chronicles recount how Lord Berkeley, one of the wealthiest and most powerful nobles of the realm, was forced to wait 6 months before receiving a royal audience, and even then the meeting lasted barely minutes. Why? Because Hugh disliked him. Such was the scale of Hugh's influence. The effect on government was profound. Council meetings, once the venue for vigorous debate among bishops, earls, and barons, soon became echo chambers. By the year 1320, anyone who dared question Hugh's dominance found themselves exiled, stripped of lands, or simply silenced. Edward did not resist these purges. On the contrary, he seemed relieved that someone else carried the burdens of authority. The king, one chronicler observed, saw with Hugh's eyes and heard with Hugh's ears. But if Hugh's manipulation of access was alarming, his handling of finances was worse. By the year 1322, he and his father were diverting close to half of the crown's annual revenue into their private coffers. £8,000 a year, enough to buy multiple castles or to maintain several hundred knights in service, flowed into Despenser accounts. The Vita Edwardi Secundi, one of the key chronicles of the time, noted bluntly, "No gift, no pardon, no office passed without Despenser's profit." Examples of his corruption were notorious. In one case, a merchant named William de Arpel sought a license to export wool, the foundation of England's wealth. The fee should have been 20 marks. Hugh demanded 500, plus a share of all future profits. When William attempted to complain to the king, Hugh intercepted the message and had him thrown in prison for disturbing the royal peace. The man's family was forced to pay 1,000 marks for his release. It was extortion disguised as governance. Hugh's appetite extended to land as well. He seized estates under flimsy accusations of treason or debt, ensuring that rivals were ruined while his holdings grew ever larger. Even widows and orphans were not spared. Their inheritances often fell conveniently into Despenser hands. To those who opposed him, Hugh wielded the law as both shield and sword. Everything was done with proper documents, sealed with the royal hand, and therefore legally unassailable. Yet none of this could have happened without Edward. The king not only tolerated Hugh's behavior but actively endorsed it. For Edward, Hugh was more than a minister. He was a companion, a confidant, perhaps something closer. Medieval chroniclers did not shy from suggesting intimacy, using language that implied their bond was deeper than friendship. Whether true or not, the effect was the same. The king would hear no word against Hugh. It is tempting to imagine Hugh as unique, but in truth, he fit a pattern familiar to medieval Europe, the royal favorite. These men, sometimes charismatic, sometimes cunning, rose not by birthright but by proximity to power. What made Hugh different was his method. Where Gaveston had flaunted his position with arrogance and display, Hugh worked systematically, embedding himself into the daily machinery of the crown. He did not merely bask in royal affection, he weaponized it. For the nobility, this was intolerable. They faced a dilemma with no easy solution. To oppose Hugh was to oppose the king himself, an act of treason. To support Hugh was to enable a system that eroded their own traditional privileges. Many chose paralysis, hoping that time, fate, or God would intervene. But Hugh's downfall was not to come from the barons. It would come from a place far more dangerous, the Queen herself. Isabella of France, wife of Edward and daughter of Philip IV, had endured years of humiliation, neglect, and political maneuvering. When Hugh decided to target her wealth and her children, he transformed her from a sidelined consort into a determined enemy. Hugh Despenser had risen from obscurity to become the most powerful man in England. But in the medieval world, the higher a man climbed, the further he had to fall. And by making war upon the Queen, Hugh had already sown the seeds of his own destruction. By the year 1324, Hugh Despenser had already become more than a royal minister. He was the second king of England, wielding power that eclipsed even the greatest barons. He had reduced noblemen to beggars at his chamber door, diverted the treasury into his coffers, and controlled the voice of Edward II as if it were a puppet on his hand. But it was not enough. For Hugh, dominance had to be absolute, and that meant destroying the one person whose very presence threatened him, the Queen of England, Isabella of France. Isabella was no ordinary consort. She was the daughter of Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, the king who had shattered the Knights Templar and bent the papacy to his will. From childhood, she had learned that royal blood demanded resilience, calculation, and pride. Married to Edward in 1302, she had borne him children and served as a crucial link between the often hostile realms of England and France. Her role was not ceremonial. It was foundational to the stability of the crown. Hugh knew this, and still, he chose to break her. The assault began under the guise of law. In September of 1324, clerks armed with writs arrived at dawn on Isabella's estates across the kingdom. 28 properties worth more than £20,000 annually were seized for the safety of the realm. The justification was England's conflict with France, but the timing and coordination revealed Hugh's true intent. This was not policy, it was plunder. Isabella herself recorded her despair. "I am treated worse than a merchant's wife, for even she keeps her dowry." Stripped of her lands, the Queen could no longer reward allies or maintain her household with independence. In medieval Europe, land was not just wealth, it was voice. By taking her estates, Hugh silenced her politically, reducing her to dependence on whatever allowance he might grant. But the campaign did not end with property. Within weeks, Isabella's French attendants were arrested in coordinated night raids. Her physician, who had served her since childhood, was thrown into the Tower of London on fabricated charges of espionage. Her confessor was seized, her children's tutors dragged away, her closest companions scattered. The Chronicle of London records, "The Queen wept openly, but none dared comfort her, for fear of Despenser's wrath. One noblewoman who offered her a simple handkerchief was fined 100 marks for encouraging sedition." The message was unmistakable. To show sympathy for the Queen was to court ruin. Even her children were weaponized against her. Prince John, only 8 years old, was removed from her care and placed under the guardianship of Hugh's wife, Eleanor de Clare. Princess Eleanor, a child of 6, was taken to Despenser strongholds in Wales. Isabella was permitted only one supervised visit a month, always under the eyes of Hugh's agents. For a medieval queen, motherhood was not only personal but political, the source of her future authority, as regent if the king should die. By severing her from her children, Hugh sought to cripple her permanently. The humiliation reached its most public stage at Christmas of that year. Traditionally, the royal family sat together in a display of harmony before the kingdom and foreign envoys. Hugh arranged that Isabella would sit below the salt, a place reserved for minor courtiers, far from her husband. Ambassadors wrote home in shock at the sight of a queen treated as a servant in her own court. Isabella's letters from this period, preserved in French archives, speak with haunting clarity. "I am a prisoner without walls, a queen without authority, a mother without children, a wife without a husband's protection." It is tempting to view this as simple cruelty, but Hugh's strategy was more sophisticated. He understood the three pillars of medieval queenship: wealth, household, and motherhood. By stripping away her estates, imprisoning her servants, and controlling her children, he removed every foundation of her power. Legally, every action bore the king's seal. In reality, it was tyranny disguised as bureaucracy. French chroniclers called it tyranny dressed in documents. Yet in his zeal to erase Isabella, Hugh miscalculated. He believed humiliation would break her spirit. Instead, it steeled her resolve. Isabella carried the blood of Philip the Fair, the monarch who had humbled the mightiest military order of Christendom. She would not forgive. She would not forget. Ironically, while he was orchestrating Isabella's destruction, Hugh revealed another side of his ambition, one so bizarre, it still astonishes historians. When briefly exiled in 1321, he did not retreat quietly to foreign courts like other disgraced nobles. Instead, he transformed himself into something extraordinary. A pirate lord. Yes, the royal chamberlain of England took to the seas. Chroniclers struggled to contain their disbelief. The Lanercost Chronicle wrote, "Despenser, who judged others for theft, became the greatest thief upon the narrow seas." In just 3 months, Hugh's fleet captured 16 merchant vessels. These were not fishing boats. They were heavily laden trading ships carrying wool, Gascon wine, Flemish cloth, and Spanish silver. The plunder was valued at £60,000, a fortune that exceeded the lifetime income of most noble families. And Hugh was no desperate outlaw. He was methodical. He kept meticulous records of his piracy, detailing sacks of wool, tons of wine, and bars of silver. Testimonies from captured merchants describe him appearing on deck, clad in courtly robes beneath his armor, commanding his men with the same precision he once used in council chambers. He even issued safe conduct passes, allowing ships that paid tribute to sail unmolested. He had created a shadow government at sea. The Cinque Ports Dover, Sandwich, Romney, Hythe, and Hastings, the backbone of England's naval defence, suffered heavily. Hugh's men raided Sandwich, burning warehouses belonging to his political enemies while carefully sparing those of allies. He even targeted Genoese ships, provoking outrage from Italian merchants and threatening international trade. What made this piracy so dangerous was not its scale but its precision. Hugh knew the shipping schedules, the debts of merchants, the values of their cargo. He chose his victims with surgical care, punishing those who had supported his exile. It was not random theft, it was economic vengeance. Why did Edward not stop him? Because Edward never wanted him gone. Even in exile, Hugh remained the king's obsession. Naval patrols were ordered everywhere except where Hugh operated. Each pound seized at sea was, in truth, a war chest for his return. By 1322, he was recalled, welcomed back to court not as a disgraced criminal, but as Edward's indispensable companion. Richer, bolder, and utterly unafraid of consequence, Hugh returned to power more dangerous than before, but his cruelty toward Isabella had set events in motion that could not be reversed. In trying to silence her, he had created his greatest enemy. The queen he treated as less than a servant would one day orchestrate the spectacle of his annihilation. And medieval England, hungry for vengeance, would turn his destruction into a performance never to be forgotten. By late November of the year 1326, Hugh Despenser's empire of intimidation had collapsed. His enemies were no longer whispered barons or silenced bishops. His enemy was the Queen of England herself, Isabella of France, and she now returned from exile with an army at her back, supported by Roger Mortimer, her lover and ally. As their forces swept across the country, Hugh and Edward fled west, desperately seeking safety. But there would be no sanctuary. On the 24th of November, in the city of Hereford, Hugh was dragged before a tribunal convened by Isabella and Mortimer. The charges were read publicly: corruption, theft of royal lands, extortion, treason, blasphemy, sodomy, piracy. He was condemned not simply to die, but to die in a manner that would obliterate every shred of dignity he had ever claimed. The city prepared for a spectacle. At dawn, a 3-story scaffold had been erected, higher than any platform ever seen there. Stalls were set up selling food, drink, and trinkets. Musicians were hired. Children were placed on their fathers' shoulders for a better view. The Queen herself took her seat in a special box draped in velvet, a chalice of wine in her hand. This was not an execution hidden in shadows. This was public theatre. The prisoner was brought out naked, his head and beard shaved, his body smeared with ashes. Across his skin, the executioners had painted words in pig's blood: traitor, thief, sodomite. Upon his scalp, they placed a crown of nettles, its stinging leaves blistering his skin. The symbolism was deliberate, a parody of Christ, but one marked not for salvation, only for ruin. Tied backwards to a horse, Hugh was dragged through the streets of Hereford. The route was chosen with care. It passed the markets where he had extorted merchants, the churches where priests denounced him, the homes of those he had robbed. Rotten food, stones, and dung rained down upon him. The crowd roared, releasing years of resentment in one deafening chorus. At last he was brought to the scaffold. The execution was designed as a sequence of acts, each with its own meaning, each performed for maximum effect. The first was partial hanging. Hugh was hoisted by the neck, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging. The crowd counted aloud, one breath after another. At the count of 40 he was lowered, revived with vinegar-soaked cloths, forced back into consciousness so the next act could begin. Then came the castration. A blade heated red in the brazier was used to sever his genitals, which were cast into the fire before his eyes. The symbolism was brutal and unmistakable: punishment for sodomy, real or alleged, and the destruction of lineage. Chroniclers noted that the crowd shouted with savage joy as they watched his manhood reduced to ash. The next stage was disembowelment. Carefully, deliberately, the executioner opened Hugh's abdomen, drawing his entrails out slowly, feeding them into the flames while priests read out his crimes: corruption, treason, blasphemy, each accusation punctuated by another scream. He remained alive long enough to feel his own body consumed by fire. Only then did the axe fall. Even this final mercy was drawn out. It took 3 blows to sever his head. The crowd cheered with each strike, and when the executioner at last held the head aloft, it was pelted with filth. But the performance was not yet complete. The corpse was quartered limbs, hacked away, and distributed across the realm as living warnings. The head was sent to London Bridge, dipped in tar, and placed in an iron cage. An arm was mounted at the gates of York, another in Bristol. A leg was displayed in Hereford, the other in Northampton. Each piece became a grotesque landmark. Children sang rhymes about Despenser's arm. Merchants in Bristol used it as a meeting place. Tar was reapplied to preserve the remains. Guards were paid to protect them from theft. Cities even allocated funds for what records call Despenser display maintenance. The theological dimension of this punishment was as devastating as the physical. In medieval belief, bodily resurrection at the Last Judgment required a whole body. By scattering his remains across the kingdom, his enemies sought not only to destroy his reputation but to damn his soul. In life, Hugh had used the law as his weapon. In death, the law was twisted against him one final time, ensuring that he could not rest. Yet the wheel of fortune was not done turning. Medieval politics thrived on cycles of revenge, and those who celebrated Hugh's death soon found themselves drawn into its orbit. 4 years later, in November of 1330, Roger Mortimer, the Queen's ally and Hugh's destroyer, was dragged to the scaffold at Tyburn. The date was no accident. Edward III, son of Isabella, and Edward II, chose it deliberately. Just as Hugh had been executed on the 24th of November, Mortimer's death came almost to the day. The symbolism was clear. The same justice you delivered, now delivered to you. Mortimer was hanged and drawn, but spared quartering, his body left intact for burial. Yet the crowd jeered at him as they had cheered him years before, a reminder that public vengeance was fickle. Isabella herself was not executed, but her punishment may have been crueler. She lived for nearly 3 decades under comfortable house arrest, forced each year to make pilgrimage to Hereford to pray for the soul of Hugh Despenser, the man she had destroyed. It was an act of psychological torment disguised as piety. Even those who played smaller roles in his execution did not escape the shadow. One chronicler records that the very executioner who had performed the 4-hour torture was found dead 2 years later, his body marked with wounds eerily similar to those he had inflicted. Others whispered that Despenser's ghost haunted those who had mocked him. Whether supernatural or political, the message was the same. Vengeance always bred more vengeance. So what does this story tell us? That medieval justice was not justice at all, but theatre. Executions were not hidden punishments, but orchestrated performances, with every detail root, symbols, words, even the music carefully planned to communicate power. Castration was not merely mutilation, it was political symbolism. Disembowelment was not simply cruelty, it was the purging of corruption. Quartering was not disposal, it was a lesson written across the landscape, and yet, in its cruelty, we see reflections of ourselves. We no longer drag traitors through streets or mount heads on bridges, but we still hunger to see the powerful fall. We gather around scandals, we revel in ruin, we demand not only justice, but obliteration. The impulse is ancient, and Hugh Despenser's death is its most chilling expression. From obscure knight to master of the king's household, from pirate lord to second king of England, Hugh climbed higher than anyone thought possible, and on that November day in Hereford, he fell further than any man of his age. His story is not just a cautionary tale of corruption punished. It is a mirror, reflecting the darkest truth of human society, that when hatred takes hold, justice becomes theatre, and the human body becomes the stage.